The world sometimes feels like a blur of moments we rush through, until one unexpected encounter slows everything down and floods us with memories we thought we'd buried long ago. It happened to me on a cloudy afternoon, the kind that feels heavy with rain and nostalgia. I was standing in line at a small cafe across the street from the hospital where I'd once spent the darkest days of my life. I wasn't supposed to be there that day. My meeting got canceled, my phone died, and something inside me just told me to take a walk instead of heading straight home. Fate has strange ways of finding us when we least expect it. I was reaching for my wallet when I heard a soft, familiar voice behind me say my name. I froze. That voice. It wasn't possible. Not after all these years. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet ways life brings people back together, make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, because what happened next changed my life in ways I'll never forget. I turned around slowly, and there she was. Older, yes, with a few more lines around her eyes and a streak of silver in her hair, but still with that same warmth that once carried me through hell. Her name came rushing back before she even said it. "Nurse Evelyn," I whispered, my voice trembling as the years between us disappeared in an instant. She gasped softly, her eyes filling with the kind of surprise that only comes when the universe stitches two souls back together. "I can't believe it's you," she said, covering her mouth with trembling fingers. "You were my favorite patient." The words hit me harder than I expected. You were my favorite patient. Simple words, but they unlocked a floodgate I didn't know was still inside me. Memories from that cold, sterile hospital room. The sound of beeping machines, the smell of disinfectant mixed with the faint scent of her lavender hand lotion. It all came back. I could almost see the pale version of myself lying there, hooked up to tubes and wires, wondering if I'd ever see another sunrise. I remembered how Evelyn would come in every night, even when her shift was supposed to end, and talk to me about anything to distract me from the pain. She had this way of making me feel human when everything around me made me feel broken. It had been 10 years since the accident, 10 years since that night on the highway, when I fell asleep behind the wheel after a double shift and woke up in the hospital barely alive. I had shattered bones, internal injuries, and a heart that didn't know if it wanted to keep beating. The doctors said survival was a miracle, but for me, it felt more like a punishment at first. I had lost my father in that accident. He had been in the passenger seat, and the guilt nearly crushed me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face and the headlights. Every time I opened them, I saw the white ceiling of the hospital room and the reflection of a life I didn't know how to live anymore. Evelyn had been the one who saw me through those nights she'd talked to me about her garden, her daughter's college dreams, and her favorite book. She never treated me like a patient. She treated me like a person who still mattered. When I couldn't move, she read to me. When I couldn't speak, she sat in silence with me. When I broke down, she simply held my hand and said, "You're still here for a reason, Alex. You don't have to know the reason yet. Just keep breathing until you do." I hadn't seen her since the day I was discharged. I tried to find her once, but the hospital said she had transferred to another branch. I eventually moved away, buried myself in work, and tried to build a life that didn't ache as much. But in that cafe, seeing her again, all the walls I'd built began to crumble. We sat at a corner table, coffee forgotten as the past unfolded between us. She told me she had retired a year ago, that she came to this cafe every week after volunteering at a community clinic nearby. I like to. "Keep busy," she said with a faint laugh, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. I told her about my life, the job, the city, the way I still drove past the spot where the accident happened every year on my father's birthday, just to remind myself of what I survived. She listened the same way she used to, with her whole heart. No interruptions, no pity, just quiet understanding. Then she said something that caught me off guard. "You know, I never forgot you. There are hundreds of patients over the years, but some people leave a mark that time can't erase. You were one of them. You used to say you wished you hadn't survived, but I remember the day you smiled for the first time after months of pain. You looked at the sunrise through your window and said, 'Maybe he's up there watching this with me.' I cried that day, Alex, because that's when I knew you were coming back to life." Her words sank into me like sunlight through the clouds. I didn't even remember saying that, but she did. She remembered everything. And suddenly, I realized something. Maybe she hadn't just saved my body, she had saved my soul. We talked for hours about loss, healing, and the invisible threads that tie people together long after goodbye. I told her about the nonprofit I had started 3 years earlier, a small organization that helped young trauma survivors rebuild their confidence through art and storytelling. "It's the only thing that makes me feel close to my dad again," I said quietly. "He used to tell me that stories heal people." Evelyn smiled with that same warmth I remembered. "I always knew you'd do something that mattered," she said softly. "You were meant to turn your pain into purpose." As she spoke, I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her cup. They were the same hands that once changed my bandages, the same hands that taught me to hold on. I suddenly realized how many lives she must have touched, how many people walk the earth today because of her. Compassion. And I couldn't help but feel that I was looking at one of the quiet heroes we often forget to thank, the kind who never ask for recognition but change lives all the same. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. The sound of it against the window was oddly soothing. We sat there in silence for a while, both lost in thought. Then Evelyn whispered something that made my throat tighten. "You know, I used to pray for you after you left. I'd sit by my window at night and ask God to help you find peace. I didn't know if you ever did, but seeing you now, I think maybe he answered. I felt tears in my eyes before I could stop them. I think he did," I said softly. For a moment, time stood still. Two people bound by a moment in history neither of us could ever forget, both survivors in our own way. After we said goodbye, I sat in my car for a long time, watching her walk away in the rain with her umbrella tilted slightly to the side, just like I remembered her doing when she'd walk through the hospital halls after midnight. It was surreal, like seeing a ghost from the past, but in the most beautiful way possible. I wanted to thank her properly, not just for taking care of me, but for teaching me how to live again. So, the next morning, I drove back to the cafe with a letter and a small potted lavender plant, her favorite scent. The waitress said Evelyn hadn't come in that day. Then she paused and frowned. "You mean Mrs. Gray? She hasn't been here in a few weeks. I think her daughter mentioned she was in the hospital again." My heart sank. I rushed to the address the waitress had for her volunteer clinic, and from there I found out where she was being treated. The irony of it hit me like a wave. The nurse who had once kept me alive was now the one lying in a hospital bed. When I walked into her room, she looked frailer than I remembered, but her eyes still had that light, that unbreakable kindness. She smiled weakly when she saw me. "You came," she whispered. "Of course I did," I said, pulling a chair closer. "You once said I had to keep breathing until I found my reason. Well, I think part of that reason was to come back and thank you. For the next few weeks, I visited her almost every day. Sometimes we'd talk about life and memory, other times we'd just sit in silence. I read her the same book she used to read to me, when she was too weak to speak. I just held her hand the way she used to hold mine. The roles had reversed, but the bond hadn't changed. One afternoon, she looked at me and said, "Promise me something, Alex. Keep helping people. Tell them they're not alone. That's how you can thank me." I nodded, unable to speak through the lump in my throat. She smiled, and for a brief second, I could see her the way I remembered her, strong, full of light, unstoppable. A few days later, Evelyn passed away peacefully in her sleep. I found out from her daughter, who hugged me and said, "She talked about you all the time. She said you were her favorite patient, and that seeing you again was like seeing one of her prayers answered." Her funeral was small, simple, and beautiful. There were former nurses, a few patients, and a lot of flowers. I brought the same lavender plant I had bought for her and placed it near her picture. As the sunlight broke through the clouds that day, I felt a strange peace, like she was still watching over me, the same way she did years ago. In the months that followed, I renamed my nonprofit Evelyn's Hands in her honor. Every year, we host a day of gratitude for healthcare workers, the unsung heroes who mend not just bodies, but hearts. And every time I speak to the young survivors in our program, I tell them about a nurse who once told me to keep breathing until I found my reason, and how I did. If this story touched your heart even a little, please like, share, and subscribe, not for me, but for all the nurses, caregivers, and silent angels who change lives every single day. Special request. Comment below with a simple "Thank you, Evelyn," to honor every nurse and caregiver who's ever shown compassion when the world felt cold. And as I stand sometimes by my window now, watching the sun rise just as I did years ago from that hospital bed, I whisper a quiet thank you to the woman who helped me believe in life again. Because somewhere, I know she's smiling, proud, peaceful, and forever part of every heartbeat she once helped save.